It is with great pleasure that my wife and I welcome you to Windsor Castle on this, your second state visit to the United Kingdom. This relationship, which, with good reason...
It is a warm evening in the fictional kingdom of Aldenmore, and the great hall of Ravensworth Castle has been prepared for the most important dinner of the year. A visiting head of state is arriving for a 2-day state visit, and the palace has spent weeks getting every detail right. Tonight's story, though, isn't really about the visiting dignitary at all. It's about a small gold place card, a 6-year-old princess, and the 2 men who refused to let that place card be moved. Long before the guests arrive, the seating plan for a state banquet has already been through more revisions than most people would imagine. In Aldenmore, as in most monarchies, the household office spends days deciding exactly who sits where, because a formal dinner like this is never just a meal. It is a map of the kingdom's priorities, drawn in place cards and chair positions. Protocol officers negotiate with senior advisors over where each guest belongs, weighing rank, relationship, and symbolism in equal measure. Nowhere is that weighing more delicate than when it involves a child who is being introduced, seat by seat, into the visible life of the crown. This year, for the first time, 6-year-old Princess Wren, daughter of Crown Prince Rowan and Princess Aloan, and third in line to the Aldenmore throne, has been given a seat at the state banquet table. It is not a large gesture on paper. It is one chair among more than 100. But inside the palace, everyone understands what it means. Wren is not just attending a family gathering. She is being formally placed, for the first time, inside the machinery of state ceremony, in a seat that photographers will capture and that observers will note for years to come. Her parents had prepared her carefully. Rowan and Aloan have always been deliberate about how their children step into public life, choosing each appearance with the same quiet intention with which most parents choose a school or a sport. Wren's seat at this banquet was not an accident of scheduling. It was a milestone, decided months in advance, discussed in private meetings, and finally confirmed on a gold card that bore her name in careful script. That card had a place. That place had been chosen, and nothing about it was supposed to change, which is exactly why what happened next mattered so much. As guests began filtering into the reception rooms before dinner, Queen Iselda, King Aldric's wife of nearly 2 decades and stepmother to Crown Prince Rowan, made her way toward the banquet table ahead of the other senior royals, wanting a quiet moment before the formal procession began. The table was already set, gold cards in place, chairs pushed neatly against white linen. Iselda, distracted by a conversation with an aide and thinking of the toast she would need to give later that evening, lowered herself into the nearest empty chair in what she assumed was her usual position near the head of the table. It was Wren's chair. The mistake was understandable in the way that mistakes at events this large usually are. A team of coordinators had spent the afternoon adjusting the table by inches, moving a card here, confirming a name there, and in the reshuffling, the seat nearest the head of the table had shifted one place to the left. Iselda, working from memory rather than the final chart, sat exactly where she always had, only always no longer applied. Nobody had told her the arrangement had changed. She had no reason to look down and check the card before sitting. A member of the household staff noticed almost immediately, positioned near the table to make a final check before the doors opened to guests. The coordinator saw the queen settle into the chair marked for the young princess and understood, in an instant, the position this put everyone in. There was no version of this where a junior staff member simply walked up to the queen and asked her to move. That is not how a royal household works. The correction, if it was going to happen, would have to come from someone with the standing to make it without embarrassing anyone. So the coordinator did the only thing available. She found the king. King Aldric was still in the adjoining reception room, greeting early arrivals with the practiced warmth of a man who has done this 1,000 times. The coordinator approached him quietly, leaned in, and explained the situation in a few low sentences. Aldric's expression didn't change in any way a guest nearby would have caught. He simply excused himself from the conversation he was having, thanked the ambassador he'd been speaking with, and walked, unhurried, toward the banquet hall. What he said to Iselda when he reached her is not something either of them has ever repeated publicly, and likely never will. Those who were close enough to sense the exchange without hearing it described Aldrich's manner as calm, brief, and entirely without theater, the tone of a man correcting a small matter, not staging a confrontation. Iselda's reaction, by every account, was immediate recognition rather than resistance. She glanced down at the card in front of her place setting, saw Wren's name, and understood at once what had happened. For a few seconds, she didn't move. It wasn't defiance. It was the natural pause of someone absorbing an uncomfortable realization in front of people who were watching, even if they were pretending not to. Rising from a chair that has just been identified as belonging to someone else is its own small public statement, an acknowledgement, played out in full view of the household staff setting the final touches on the table. That pause, brief as it was, is what allowed Crown Prince Rowan to reach the scene before Iselda had fully stood. Rowan hadn't witnessed the moment directly. He'd been near the entrance of the hall, greeting guests as they arrived, when one of the coordinators quietly told him what was unfolding at the table. He didn't wait to see whether his father's intervention would resolve things on its own. He moved toward the table immediately, arriving just as Iselda was beginning to rise. Those who know Rowan describe him as someone who rarely raises his voice in a setting like this, and rarely needs to. He has built his entire approach to fatherhood around careful, incremental introductions of his children into public duty, each appearance considered, each step sequenced deliberately so that Wren and her younger brother behind her grow into their roles rather than being thrust into them. A seat at a state banquet, for him, was never a small detail. It was a decision he and Aloan had made together, one piece of a much larger plan for how their children's public lives would unfold. So when he reached the table, he said very little. He didn't need a long speech to make his point. He simply confirmed, quietly and evenly, that the seat belonged to his daughter, thanked his father for having already addressed it, and stood beside the chair until it was clear the matter was settled. Iselda, for her part, rose without protest, offered a brief and genuine apology, and stepped away toward her correct seat, which, in the reshuffled chart, was only a few places further down. By the time the doors opened and the first guests were shown to their seats, the table looked exactly as the household office had designed it. Wren's chair was empty and waiting, gold card perfectly aligned, as though nothing at all had happened in the 10 minutes before. Princess Wren herself never saw any of it. She had still been upstairs at the time, being dressed and walked through the evenings scheduled by her nanny, rehearsing the small formalities a 6-year-old is expected to manage at a banquet of this size. How to greet an ambassador, how long to sit still before dessert, when it would finally be acceptable to whisper to her older brother across the table. She arrived to find her seat exactly where it was supposed to be, sat down with the unbothered calm that seems to run in her family, and spent the evening entirely unaware that, less than half an hour earlier, two of the most powerful people in the kingdom had made sure that chair stayed hers. That, in a way, is the quiet center of this story. The protection that mattered most wasn't visible to the person it protected. Wren didn't need to know a mistake had happened, because the adults around her made certain the mistake never reached her evening at all. She sat through the banquet believing, correctly, that her seat had always been secure, because by the time she arrived, it was. It would be easy to treat this as nothing more than a seating mix-up, the kind of logistical hiccup that happens at any event with more than 100 place settings and a schedule measured in minutes. But inside a royal household, seating is never just logistics. It's a language. Where a person sits, how close to the head of the table, how visible in the eventual photographs, all of it is read, both by the people in the room and by the observers who will study the images afterward. A young princess's placement at her first state banquet is a signal about her future role, sent quietly through architecture rather than announcement. Displacing that seat, even by accident, briefly rewrites a signal that had been carefully composed. That's part of why the response came as fast and as firmly as it did. Aldrich didn't wait to see whether the situation would sort itself out. Rowan didn't assume his father's intervention was sufficient on its own and hang back. Both men moved independently and immediately because both understood what was actually at stake in that chair, not comfort, not convenience, but the visible confirmation of where Wren belongs within the institution's future. A king and a future king, correcting the same moment within minutes of each other, sends a message that neither one alone could send as clearly. This is not a detail that bends, even for the Queen herself. None of this reflects poorly on Iselda in any lasting way. Those close to her describe exactly what it appeared to be, a genuine mix-up in a room full of last-minute adjustments, made by someone who has navigated hundreds of formal events and simply worked from memory in a moment when memory was no longer accurate. She didn't argue, didn't linger, didn't try to explain herself at length in front of the staff. She recognized the situation, corrected it, and moved on with the composure that has become one of her most consistent qualities in public life. If anything, the grace of her response is as much a part of this story as the firmness of Aldrich and Rowan's. What lingered afterward wasn't tension between the adults involved. By all accounts, the evening proceeded warmly, and the visiting dignitary noticed nothing unusual at all. What lingered was a kind of quiet clarity among the household staff who witnessed the exchange, the sense that they had just watched something get settled that mattered more than the minute it took to settle it. In palaces, as in most institutions built on symbolism, the small moments people don't talk about often carry more weight than the ones they do. Later that night, once the guests had gone and the hall had emptied, Aldrich spoke briefly with both Iselda and Rowan, separately, not to assign blame, but to make sure everyone left the evening on the same footing. He has spent decades learning how to hold a family together that doesn't always move in one direction, and he treated this the way he treats most internal friction, not as a crisis to be dissected, but as a moment to be closed cleanly, so it doesn't quietly reopen at the next big event. Rowan, for his part, wasn't looking to relitigate anything. He'd done what he needed to do. The chair was Wren's. It stayed Wren's. That was the whole of it, as far as he was concerned. By the next morning, the only public record of the evening was the official photograph. The banquet hall in full formal splendor, the royal family arranged exactly as planned. Princess Wren seated in her rightful place beside her parents, looking entirely at ease in a room built for people 3 and 4 times her age. Nothing in the image hinted at the 10 minutes before the doors opened. That was, in its own way, the point. The people responsible for protecting Wren's evening did their job well enough that there was nothing left to see. Years from now, when Wren is grown and sitting at state banquets of her own, in seats she'll have long since stopped needing anyone to defend for her, this particular evening likely won't be a story she remembers, because it was never allowed to become one for her in the first place. It will only exist as something the adults around her carried quietly, proof, if anyone ever needed it, that in this family, when a child's name is on the card, that name is not treated as optional. That's the whole of it. Not a scandal, not a rift, just a small, closely guarded moment where 2 people made sure a 6-year-old's first real step into public life happened exactly the way it was supposed to, and made sure she never had to know it all.